let's begin by reviewing a little bit some of the points we covered in the last session before we move on. So we're looking at the main part of the Heart Sutra. And the main part of the Heart Sutra is a question-answer between Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara. So Shariputra is asking, how should someone who is interested in following the Mahayana path to enlightenment, i.e. someone who's cultivated great compassion and is wanting to follow the Mahayana path to enlightenment, how are they to practice this wisdom of emptiness? And so in Avalokiteshvara's reply, that is correlated with the different stages of the Mahayana path to enlightenment, how to practice this wisdom of emptiness. And so initially, of course, we saw that in the initial stages of the path, but also as a beginner, we approach the emptiness practice through investigation, that we investigate in a very methodical, logical way, how do things exist. In particular, we start by, generally recommended, start by focusing on me, the person. How do I exist? Is there this independent me here that seems to be here? And then we can investigate, and then to subsequently see in a correct way that the person, also the body and mind, are empty of inherent nature. And so then, through this investigation, we can have some taste or experience of emptiness, of this not finding the independent me. But that experience, of course, is a conceptual experience, because there's a sense of me, the meditator, having this experience of emptiness, the object. And even on the path of accumulation preparation, we're still having that experience, although now instead of an experience, it's a realization, because now on these stages of the path, we have developed single-pointed concentration, the shamatha state of mind. And so now that experience, that realization, even though it's conceptual, is very strong and has the ability to sort of keep the lid on the mental afflictions. That what you will notice at this point in the path is, outside of meditation, mental afflictions like attachment, jealousy, anger, and so forth don't come up very often, and when they do, they're very weak and they last a very short time. When we move then to the path of seeing, then we have our first direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness. Now we become an Arya Bodhisattva. Now that direct realization of emptiness is strong enough to start to eliminate ignorance and mental afflictions. But we need to realize this emptiness directly again and again and again, many times, to slowly wipe out all the ignorance and mental afflictions. That's what we're doing on the path of meditation. And by the end of the 7th ground, we have wiped out all ignorance, mental afflictions, and thereby all suffering. We have achieved nirvana. We've gone beyond samsara. But still, there are these subtle stains in our mind that is causing this mistaken dualistic appearance. They're very difficult to get rid of, but that's what we do over the 8th, 9th, and 10th ground, is, again, through a realization of emptiness, we are slowly purifying our mind of these subtle stains. And so in the next paragraph, we're going to come up to the point of what happens right at the end of that path of meditation when we wipe out the last subtle stain of ignorance. And so that's coming up shortly. But before that, there's a couple more things to talk about here in this first paragraph on the 2nd page. So the last point we looked at was there is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to including no aging and death and no extinction of aging and death. So of course this is talking about the 12 links, which we briefly looked at before lunch. And here when it says there is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, so on up to including no aging and death and no extinction of aging and death, this is talking about the 12 links in what's called the forward order and the reverse order. In the forward order, we see that ignorance leads to this, to this, to this, leads to birth, aging, and death. So the forward order is telling us how we are stuck in the cycle of samsara. But if we do the reverse order, then we understand through extinguishing, to extinguish birth, aging, and death, we have to extinguish the previous one. We go right back, we have to extinguish ignorance. So then here in the Heart Sutra, it's describing both. When it says no ignorance, it's talking about the forward order, and no extinction of ignorance is talking about the reverse order, how to break free. So when it says no ignorance, of course, what it's explicitly saying is that ignorance does not inherently exist. And no extinction of ignorance is saying there's no inherently existent extinction of ignorance. So explicitly, the Heart Sutra is saying none of these 12 links inherently exist. Implicitly, of course, it's presenting the 12 links. There is ignorance leading to formative actions, leading to so forth. So that's where we left off. So if we go to the next sentence in the Heart Sutra then, it says, similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. So of course here, this is talking about the Four Noble Truths. Truth of suffering, truth of origination, truth of cessation, truth of the path, leading to the cessation of suffering. So when it says there is no suffering, of course explicitly it's saying suffering or dukkha does not inherently exist. That none of these Four Noble Truths inherently exist, but again implicitly it is presenting the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, there is origination, there is a cessation of suffering and its causes, and there's a path leading to the cessation of suffering. So this is the Four Noble Truths. And then it talks about, it says, there is no exalted wisdom. So no exalted wisdom, here the exalted wisdom, when we see the word exalted in front of wisdom, normally that is talking about the wisdom directly realizing emptiness. So what it's saying is that this wisdom directly realizing emptiness also does not inherently exist. And of course implicitly it's saying there is a wisdom directly realizing emptiness. And then we see no attainment and also no non-attainment. So here attainment and non-attainment is talking about a little bit like in the path of seeing, where we talked about increase of qualities, decrease of faults. Similarly here, when we talk about attainment, we're talking about attaining certain qualities. And non-attainment is talking about abandoning certain faults. So no attainment means none of the qualities that we attain inherently exist. And no non-attainment means none of the faults and obscurations that we're abandoning inherently exist. But that's explicitly. Implicitly, of course, it's saying we do attain qualities and there we do abandon faults and obscurations in the path. So that then finishes the presentation here, which is correlated to this path of meditation. So then we come to the next paragraph, which is correlated to, we see here, to the path of no more learning. So again, before we look at the Heart Sutra, let's go back to our Mahayana path chart and have a look at this path of no more learning. So we said that on the path of seeing plus up to the 7th ground of the path of meditation, we are, through our direct realization of emptiness, we're slowly wiping out more ignorance and mental afflictions until we reach the end of the 7th ground. We've now wiped out all ignorance, mental afflictions, and all suffering. Now we have transcended samsara and achieved nirvana. But since we're on the Mahayana path, our goal is enlightenment. So nirvana is like a sort of a byproduct of our path. Because what's still left to do is we still have these subtle stains in our mind that is causing this mistaken dualistic appearance. Remember, these are called the cognitive obscurations. So that's what's blocking us from moving from nirvana to enlightenment. So we need to get rid of these subtle stains, and we do that by, again, continually realizing emptiness directly. And over those 8th, 9th and 10th ground, we wipe out those very subtle stains in our mind. And then at the end of the 10th ground here, we sit down in meditation on emptiness for the last time. We have a direct realization of emptiness, and while we're realizing that emptiness directly, we are wiping out the last subtle stain in our mind. And as soon as that's wiped out, in the very next instant, the whole phenomenal world appears to us, and we're still realizing emptiness directly. And so then we move into this path of no more learning, and we have achieved enlightenment, and we've become Buddha. So now, instead of being an Arya Bodhisattva, now we are an Arya Buddha. So a person who's achieved enlightenment, of course, is called Buddha, fully awakened. And now we are seeing the phenomenal world and the emptiness simultaneously. So as an enlightened being, we are not receiving this mistaken dualistic appearance that we all have now. What that really means is for us unimaginable, because we've never had that experience. But that is how an enlightened being sees the world. So let's have a look at the Heart Sutra related to that, that's correlated with that, and see what the Heart Sutra says. So the first sentence in that paragraph says, Shariputra, therefore because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. So here it says, therefore because there is no attainment. So here the word attainment is referring to attaining enlightenment. So no attainment means that also the enlightened state does not inherently exist. Because, again, and implicitly, of course, there is an attainment of the enlightened state, but explicitly here it's saying that state does not inherently exist.
It's permanent? Would someone get enlightened?
In Buddhism, when we hear the word permanent and impermanent, we need to be very careful in our understanding. Normally, or very often at least, when we use the word permanent and impermanent, for us that often means, permanent means it lasts forever, impermanent means it does not last forever. This is not the meaning of permanent and impermanent in Buddhism. In fact, the original Tibetan and Sanskrit word literally means changing and unchanging. So the word permanent and impermanent in Buddhism is not telling us how long something lasts. All that those words are doing is telling us, does this phenomena change from one moment to the next or not? If it changes from one moment to the next, it's impermanence. If it doesn't, it's permanent. So we can have impermanent things that last forever, and we can have permanent things which last a very short time. So we need to be careful when we see those words. So better is the word changing and unchanging. So I think your question is rather, is the enlightened state something that will continue, or do we become enlightened and sometimes we become unenlightened later? And the answer is, once we achieve enlightenment, then we stay in that state. You can't fall back, because there is no cause. You can't have ignorance arising from without a cause. So once you've eliminated ignorance, there is no cause for it to come back again. So once you achieve the enlightened state, then that is continuous from then on. I think this is your question, yeah?
Without no attainment. I have one version that there's no attainment because we have a good nature.
I didn't hear, sorry, speak up.
Without no attainment,
Yeah.
there's nothing to attain because we have a good nature.
Okay, yeah. So here, of course, in the Heart Sutra, we're talking about how things exist. So the no attainment here is saying that attainment does not inherently exist. In other contexts, sometimes you'll hear this expression, there's nothing to be attained. But that's not talking about whether or not it inherently exists. It's a way of speaking about the spiritual path. And it's a particular perspective. And the spiritual path, we can have at least two perspectives of it. One is that the perspective we have is that here we are now, ordinary person, we need to do all of these practices to create the causes for achieving enlightenment, to attain enlightenment. So that's one perspective, valid. But equally well, we can have another perspective. Because this perspective is that I have mental afflictions in my mind, but I can eliminate those mental afflictions and thereby achieve enlightenment. Another perspective is that beneath these mental afflictions is the purity of the mind already. All I need to do is remove those mental afflictions to see what was already present. Also another perspective. And the analogy I use for this is, to help understand, is the analogy of a window with dirt. One perspective is, there's a dirty window, I need to put effort to produce a clean window. And often this is the perspective we have. I'm creating or producing a clean window by removing the dirt. So that's this perspective. But equally well, we could say, actually, there's already a clean window there. All we have to do is take off the dirt to reveal the clean window that was already there. There are two perspectives of the same thing. And so here, particularly in the Mahayana path, we often find that with what's called Buddha nature. Sometimes Buddha nature is described as the potential for enlightenment. And so that's the first perspective. You know, we've got this potential, put some effort, we can achieve enlightenment. Another way of describing Buddha nature is that there is already the enlightened state within, the Buddha within. All we have to do is remove the dirt, the mental afflictions, to reveal the Buddha that was already there. Both are valid perspectives. Both have advantages and disadvantages. Often, and particularly this is the case in our modern society, the first perspective, that Buddha nature is a potential, in our modern society, the disadvantage with that often is, oh, I have to do all this work, I just can't do it. I mean, it's way, 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 way in the distance, this goal of enlightenment. I'm just not very good, I can't meditate. How am I supposed to do all this work to achieve this far away goal of enlightenment? Too much. So we get disheartened. So that's a potential side effect of this perspective. We can adopt this idea. But equally well, the other perspective can have a disadvantage. Because if we have the perspective there's a Buddha within, we could go, oh, I'm already enlightened. I don't need to do anything. And even worse than that, oh, since I'm enlightened, everything I do is from the enlightened mind, so everything I do is okay. And so then often people even become unethical because of that. But at least what can happen is that they don't put effort because I'm already enlightened, I don't need to do anything. So both of these perspectives have advantages and disadvantages, so we can adopt a perspective that works best for us. And we can even sort of mix them a little bit, as long as we understand their perspectives. It's not like one's right, one's wrong. So I think this is your question, yeah, about no attainment. So no attainment would be, in this context, would be talking about there's nothing new to attain because it's already there. All we've got to do is remove the dirt to reveal what's already there. So that would be the second perspective. But that no attainment is not what's being talked about here in the Heart Sutra. Here we're talking about attainment, how attainment exists, not whether or not we need to attain or not. It's that the state of enlightenment is not inherently existent.
There's, I think in Zen Buddhism, they talk about
Satori.
And that it comes again and again. So, like Dogen wrote about the remains of Satori comes again. And here it's a really long way, and Satori seems more
Easy.
easy. Or
Yes, and we all want the easy path.
Yeah, but how does it come? It's different enlightenment.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is one of the potential disadvantages with this perspective, because we see this. We see instant enlightenment. Oh yes, that's for me. I don't want to do all this hard work. Give me the instant enlightenment. And then people sit there and go, let's have this instant enlightenment. And then usually they just sit there and sit there and sit there, and nothing happens. And then often they sort of space out a bit and they go, oh, I just got a bit of instant enlightenment. Oh, I'm enlightened now.
Satori is that, or it's
Satori is just a taste. Basically, it's a taste of emptiness. So again, both of these perspectives have advantages and disadvantages. So we need to be careful that we don't fall into understanding these perspectives in a not a good way and either not doing anything or feeling like we're hopeless and we can't do anything. So that's why I think it's important to have a qualified teacher. And so if we're following the second way, this sort of instant enlightenment approach, and we're just sort of sitting there spacing out, I think the teacher's going to be very harsh on us.
In another search, like Vata,
With what, sorry?
in another spiritual search for the I, for the me,
Yeah.
right? They instruct us to come to a place where there is one thing that doesn't change. Everything it changes, but let's come to a place that's and it's after doing the Lord years, I feel that place is the awareness or because from this place all things arise. So how is it connected to
Right.
emptiness?
In this approach, and we find this particularly exemplified in Tibetan traditions such as Mahamudra and Dzogchen, we're trying to come into awareness, but what we're trying to do is not just rest in awareness, because resting in awareness is just shamatha practice. Shamatha. What we're trying to do is to rest in the experience of indivisible emptiness and awareness. Because the thing that doesn't change here is the emptiness. So merely resting in awareness is not an experience of emptiness. But again, often people, and it's not that hard to rest in awareness, in the stillness of the mind. And then often people misunderstand that. Oh, I'm resting in Rigpa, I'm resting in very subtle mind, I'm Vidyadhara, I'm nearly enlightened. And then they become very delusional. So again, it's important to have a qualified teacher, because this simply resting in awareness, the mind goes still, is they say non-conceptual. The direct realization of emptiness is non-conceptual. And so if we're resting in this awareness, it's very easy to go, oh, I'm directly realizing emptiness. And we're nowhere near emptiness. So the meditation texts are full of warnings to meditators. Please do not misinterpret a simple resting in the stillness of awareness as a realization of emptiness, because it's not. Yeah, it can be a good way to emptiness.
It also takes many years.
It can do, of course. But this is another approach to emptiness. Yes, but it's only an approach. Like this is an approach.
Can I ask you? You said that it's not me who is the person. It's my anger. It's the same. It's also identifying with the me.
And often what people do,
there is a body, or there is an anger.
and that can happen. We rest in awareness and we go, that's the real me. Awareness, that's me. And that's just another grasping. So instead of grasping onto body and mind as me, now we're grasping onto awareness as me.
So how do you know that you are non-space now?
By getting good instructions and being able to give feedback to a teacher. If you don't have good instructions and you have no way of asking questions to a teacher, it's very easy to space out and think we're really going somewhere. Very easy. Spacing out, well, of course, in the middle of spacing out, we don't know we're spaced out. After spacing out, we go, oh, we realize we were just spaced out. Because when you're spaced out, it means you have no awareness. Your mind has got completely dull. Nothing's registering. It's only afterwards you realize, oh, for the last period of time I was completely spaced out, like half asleep. Because if you say, oh, I'm spaced out, by definition you're no longer spaced out. Because you're aware. Being aware of spaced out only happens after the event. When you've come out of that and you go, oh, I was just spaced out now for the last whatever time. What is, sorry?
It is formulated, the sutra is on the negation.
Emptiness, yeah.
On the negation.
Right.
It is not.
Right.
My question is, can you say something affirmative?
Yes.
Not what it is not, but you cannot define anything by saying what it is not.
Right. The affirmative or flip side is dependent arising. But to realize dependent arising, we have to go through emptiness. So first, we realize emptiness, and when we come out of that meditation, because of that direct realization of emptiness, we directly realize that things are dependent arisings. Because before realizing emptiness, when we talk about dependent arisings, we are still grasping onto them. So intellectually, of course, we can understand this cup is merely labelled, only exists in conceptual framework, but that's not a realization of dependent arising. So to realize that, it comes through realizing emptiness directly. Once we realize emptiness directly, then we come out of that and we look at that cup, we directly realize this is merely labelled. And that's the positive, affirmative. Because until we have that direct realization of emptiness, any affirmative statement we do is with grasping, so then it's misleading. That's why when people say everything's one, that is still dualistic talk. Again, you can only say everything's not two. If we have that direct realization of emptiness, and someone were to and we came out of it, and someone asks us, please describe that experience and please describe how things exist, we'd be speechless. We couldn't use words to describe to them.
No, what you're saying is that words are not able to describe it.
Correct. They can
So
only
we are-
point.
So we are beyond language.
In the yeah, exactly. The direct realization of emptiness is beyond language. Exactly. Because language is within the dualistic framework. Language at our stage, of course, is necessary and helpful to get us there.
That's for sure.
Sure.
But on the level of language,
Yeah.
is there anything which is that we are not misled? I mean, in the language, is there anything that Buddhism says it is not changing? Because everything is changing.
Except emptiness. Emptiness is not changing.
So this is the only one.
No.
Only one. No.
Anything that is created by causes and conditions is changing.
No, that's, I'm asking you.
So what I'm saying is, yeah. So therefore, any phenomena that is a negation is unchanging.
But that's game with words.
No.
Negation of is again we are in the samsara of words. Negation of you didn't say what it is. You said what it is not.
Right. And what it is, it's not that.
Okay.
Because whenever you say it's that,
You're lost.
we're pointing, we're finding something, which means it's like Einstein said, you can't solve the problem at the level you created it.
Yeah.
So any positive statement is part of the problem.
Label.
Yeah. We can use words to point towards emptiness, but you can't use words to positively describe that, because words is part of the problem. Okay. So it says here, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom. The mind without obscuration, without fear. So here, rely on, so the bodhisattva is relying on the perfection of wisdom. So the bodhisattva has, the whole way along the path of meditation, has been relying on the perfection of wisdom, relying on the direct realization of emptiness to move along the path. But here it says rely on and dwell, meaning now it's talking about at the end of the path of meditation, the bodhisattva is now, again, relying on the perfection of wisdom, relying on the direct realization of emptiness, and now they're dwelling in that direct realization of emptiness. They eliminate the last stain, and then they continue to dwell in that perfection of wisdom, become enlightened, and the whole phenomenal world appears. And it says they're without obscuration and without fear. So, of course, ignorance has long since been eliminated, so there can be no fear can only come because of ignorance. And without obscuration means now, at this very last point of the path of meditation, that last subtle stain, which is the last bit of the cognitive obscuration, has been eliminated. So there's no longer any obscuration, no afflictive or cognitive obscurations, all gone. So now they have entered the path of no more learning and have achieved enlightenment. And it says, having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. But here, we're talking about achieving enlightenment, but they're using the word nirvana here. So it seems like it's a bit misleading. What do they mean here? There are two types of nirvana. There's what's called solitary peace and non-abiding nirvana. Solitary peace is what we would normally call nirvana, that we go beyond the mental afflictions and suffering and we achieve this state of peace, meaning that the mind now is completely free of any mental afflictions and suffering. If we achieve this nirvana in this life, and then at the end of this life this body finishes, then according to the different philosophical systems in Buddhism, they interpret that differently. In, I think, most of the Theravada Buddhist traditions, remember the one etymology of the word nirvana is to fully blow out, like a candle. So often in these traditions, when you achieve nirvana, become an arhat, and at the end of this life, this body finishes, then literally everything is blown out. No more body, no more mind, contaminated mind, finished. And then you ask, well, what's left over? Often the answer is it's indescribable. But definitely, based on this understanding, that person who achieved nirvana will never ever manifest in the world again. Finished, blown out. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, their interpretation is that if someone achieves nirvana and at the end of that life this body finishes, they end up not getting completely blown out like a candle, but they end up in a state of solitary peace, meaning that there is no longer any cause to be reborn in samsara again, of course, and their motivation was to achieve nirvana. So we end up in this mental state of solitary peace where we have no connection with anything else in the universe. We're just in that state of solitary peace. And the Mahayana assertion is we stay in that state for a long, 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 long time. But eventually, we'll come out of that state because we'll realize it's not the final goal, it's only a temporary state. We will then appear in the world again, but not in samsara, of course, and we will continue on to achieve enlightenment. And so the word non-abiding nirvana is simply another word for enlightenment. And so that's what's meant here in the Heart Sutra when it says the end point of nirvana is this state of enlightenment. So earlier we talked about two extremes in terms of existence and non-existence, in terms of the view. But here we can talk about two extremes in terms of abiding. So one extreme that we want to avoid is the extreme of samsara. We don't want to abide in samsara. But as a bodhisattva striving for enlightenment, the other extreme is solitary peace. Because if we get stuck in this state, we can get stuck there for a long time, and while we're there, we have no connection with anything else in the universe. We can't help anyone. So from a bodhisattva perspective, this is an extreme we want to avoid. Before, when we looked at the extreme of existence and non-existence in terms of view, we said the way to overcome the extreme of existence is realize emptiness. And the way to overcome the extreme of non-existence or nihilism is to realize that things are dependent arising. How do we avoid or overcome the extreme of samsara? Realizing emptiness, or in other words, wisdom. How do we overcome the extreme of nirvana? bodhicitta, or compassion, but bodhicitta. So as a bodhisattva, this is how we can avoid the two extremes, by wisdom and compassion, or the wisdom of emptiness and bodhicitta. If we have those two together, we can find the middle way and achieve enlightenment. So that's what's being said here in the Heart Sutra. And then it says, all the Buddhas who dwell in the three times means past, present and future, also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. So what it's saying here in the Heart Sutra is that to achieve enlightenment, the perfection of wisdom is essential. Remember, perfection of wisdom is a direct realization of emptiness together with bodhicitta. This is necessary if we want to achieve enlightenment. So does that mean we have to be a Buddhist to achieve enlightenment? No, but the Buddhist assertion is that to achieve enlightenment, we need bodhicitta and the wisdom of emptiness. If you can generate those from some other tradition, you can achieve enlightenment. Any questions? Yeah.
Normally we think that the mind is coming out of existing body. Normally we don't think of the mind without the body. And even more than that, we don't think of a body that comes out of the mind. So what's the viewpoint? Doesn't Buddhism have any problem with that?
Right. There's a lot to say about that, but I'll give a brief answer. Of course, in the last 400 years of modern science, the main agenda that's being pursued is that what's fundamental is matter and energy. That's it. And then, of course, along comes the idea of mind or consciousness, which is a bit awkward because it doesn't fit neatly into the matter and energy. So you get a couple of different ways of fitting it in. One of the most common ways is that the mind or consciousness is simply the brain, the function of the brain, or some emergent property of the brain. Often it's explained in that way. But even some more creative scientists now, philosophers as well, are saying, well, actually, they often talk about the hard problem. How does a non-material mind talk to a material world? And then some creative scientists and philosophers now say, well, there's no problem because actually there's no mind. That conscious experience is an illusion. I mean, really, they say this, which I find a bit puzzling, but and they really believe it, that there's no such thing as conscious experience. So then what is the primary is matter and energy, and that consciousness either doesn't exist or it's some sort of property of that. Then it fits neatly into that theory. Buddhism would say that actually consciousness is primary. And that, particularly in this view of emptiness, there is no duality of mind and matter, because duality doesn't exist. But the key is that really consciousness is primary. And anyway, there's more to say about that, but maybe I'll leave it there. So yeah.